and we did it in 4 minutes today, Chris, so apologies. It normally, I think, a little shorter than that, but thank you very much for the White House consultancy for their contribution also, and for your support, Chris and Laura and the team. It really is appreciated. So let's move on to the the main event today, how the pandemic has highlighted the importance of local media and how it can endure. And I have to say, I'm in Warrington today, and have spent more time in Warrington in the last year than I ever expected since being elected as a Member of Parliament. And the local media, from my perspective, as a Member of Parliament, has never been more important for delivering relevant and timely information. And we're very lucky in Warrington to have a very vibrant local media, but it's changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And I think hopefully today we can talk about how it's going to change in the future and what's happened, particularly over the last year as a result of the pandemic to local media. I have some housekeeping rules that I just wanted to sort of highlight to you again. Microphones are on mute. If you have any questions, any points you want to raise, you're more than welcome to do that to our panelists. And all we ask you to do is to put them in the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll pick those up as we go through the session. And the event is also being recorded for promotional purposes. So let me move on and introduce our speakers today. We have 4 really experienced speakers coming from different sections of the media, and in particular looking at print and newspaper journalism today. But our first speaker is Matt Ridsdale, who's the Executive Director of Camelot, the operator of the National Lottery. Matt joined Camelot in 2017 and leads the Corporate Affairs Department, which is responsible for enhancing and promoting the reputation of Camelot and the National Lottery. Prior to that, he was the joint CEO of Tavistock, a leading communications consultancy. And Matt, before we sort of move on to some of the questions, you're a major advertiser in newspapers, in local radio. You really support local media around the UK.
Hi, Lee. Yeah, we do. We've I think our sense is we clearly also support national organisations, and as the National Lottery, that's hardly surprising. The National Lottery funds things that unite us as the UK. They fund things that are sources of national pride, whether that's the Angel of the North or Team GB. But actually, perhaps what is missed all too often is that the National Lottery is the sum total of all the small things. So actually, it's funded 600,000 projects. It's funded 220 projects for every postcode area. And in order to make people aware of what is funded locally, you're very unlikely to be able to do that through national media. So we've got pretty innovative partnerships with regional and local titles, and with organisations like Reach, that has a fantastic network of regional operations and regional titles. So we are the operator of the National Lottery, but we know that it's the aggregate of all of the communities across the UK that benefit from funding, because every Saturday people go and buy a ticket with a chance to win.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you and talk more about your work later. I want to introduce the rest of the panel. Joshi Herrmann, who is the founder of Manchester Mill. That was founded in June last year, a unique new local news site which is focused on quality journalism rather than clicks. They're based in Manchester, as the name suggests, offering both free and paid for subscriptions. The Mill was launched to provide the people of Manchester with content which truly allows them to understand what's going on in their local area. Joshi, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Bit of a challenge launching a site like that right in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. Thanks for having me along to this. It was a challenge, but I think, as you said at the beginning, when you were talking about Warrington, there's never been a time for decades when local media has been so important. So actually launching it sort of was appropriate because people wanted accurate local information set out in a clear way that they can sort of digest. And so in that sense, I think we came along at a good time. It's obviously challenging, and I think that the bounce the traffic bounce that a lot of sites have had out of the pandemic is a good thing. It shows how relevant local media is, how salient it is. But I think it probably should not disguise for us or make us sort of complacent about the very big issues we have in local media. The sort of decline we're seeing in local media, the job losses every year, which have continued last year and will continue this year. So I guess I'd be interested in talking a little bit about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome to the panel. John McLellan is the director of the Scottish Newspaper Society and one of Scotland's most experienced senior journalists, having previously been editor-in-chief of Scotsman Publications. He's worked for newspapers throughout the UK, is an honorary professor of journalism in the University of Stirling, and is currently serving as a City of Edinburgh councillor for the Scottish Conservatives. John, we often think about local media, but Scotland has local, national, and obviously UK media. Is it a completely different picture in Scotland in terms of local media?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, the function and is the same. I suppose that the only difference is that we historically have publications which are national publications in a Scottish context, but which might be regarded as regional publications in a UK context. But those are titles with a very proud heritage, and in many respects are those which have felt the financial pressures of the digital revolution most pointedly, because they don't have the scale, but they still have the responsibility and the costs associated with publishing national quality news, but without the ability to tap into large audiences. And I think that we are, what we are seeing now is the need in an era where digital data capture is everything, as the New York Times is proving on a daily basis, that scale is really important in the new in the new financial underpinning behind big news publications. And I think that that in a setup where you're naturally required to perform to the same level in a political sense as the big titles like the Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, New York Times, and the Washington Post. If you haven't got the scale, that becomes very difficult. But I think that in the context of this discussion about the importance of local press, the one thing that's come over loud and clear is that the strength and the health of the local press is absolutely essential for the national press to be able to make its arguments effectively. The health of the local press is absolutely directly linked with the health of the national press, and I think that's been a big lesson of the pandemic.
Great. I think we can come back and talk a bit more about that as we go through the session. I want to finally introduce our final speaker, Maria Breslin, who is the editor of the local Liverpool Echo, a paper that I occasionally delve into as I'm parts of my constituency that look towards Merseyside. She became the first woman editor of the title in 140 years a few years back, and she is passionate about local news, having recently made the decision to extend the Echo's daily coverage of the Wirral to ensure the paper's longevity and relevance to its surrounding areas. Maria, you have a newspaper that has a huge heritage in terms of campaigning and championing everything that is Liverpool. But you're extending out and growing at a time when people think perhaps newspapers are shrinking and disappearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, across our group, we enjoyed 32% page view increase in 2020 and 26% revenue growth in the last quarter. So, it's a healthier position than some would have us think. You're right. I think shortly after Christmas, we hired a public interest reporter who's now started, and a Wirral editor. And we're currently advertising for 4 more jobs as we seek to push into St Helens and Sefton and strengthen the coverage that we already have there.
Thank you very much. Great to have you on the panel. To all of our speakers, we're going to come back and talk more about some of the issues that are really impacting on local media and how they think it's going to change in the years to come. And as I said earlier, if you want to raise a question, please place it in the chat, and we will come to those questions as we move through the session. I want to start with really looking at how you think local media has performed during the pandemic. Local media arguably experienced a renaissance, and as you were just saying, Maria, you're hiring. What do you think's actually prompted this? Is it simply down to people really want to understanding what's happening in their backyard?
Yeah, I think so. I think in troubled times, people turn to trusted brands, really. And over the past year, our absolute #1 priority has been to give our readers information, and that's accurate information from credible sources, and that's fact-checked by qualified journalists. And I think that's important to help them make accurate and good decisions. The internet is a noisy place, and sometimes I think they need a little bit of help in cutting through that noise. And I think with a trusted brand like the Liverpool Echo, you get that. People turn to us in absolutely unprecedented numbers. And I was really passionate at making sure that we responded to everybody. It was everything from people concerned about the safety conditions, maybe in the factory they worked in, people wanting to highlight good community activity to help the needy, or rainbow pictures. We had so many rainbow pictures, and we actually restructured the way we worked because I thought it's really important we responded to everybody. And we did that. We had one person full-time just responding to all these messages that came by phone, by email, by social platforms. And I thought that was important, that we're really in touch with our readers. And, you know, I've made no apologies for the depth of our coverage of the pandemic. It has undoubtedly dominated the news agenda over the past year. I think we were the first regional title to go into a COVID ward in the Royal Liverpool Hospital. I think I had an email from a professor at the University of Liverpool who said that she believed that our coverage of the second wave had actually saved lives. Now that's really hard to quantify, but if we did, then that's public service journalism at its absolute best, I think.
Excellent, thank you. John, can I come to you? From your experience in your markets, what do you think has driven the renaissance during this period?
Well, I think as Maria said, that the internet's a very noisy place, and the social media even noisier. I think that people want something that makes sense of the tangle of messages that they receive, and the one of the most vital functions that the local media does is that when it covers something, that's an affirmation that that's a serious piece of information, and that there is substance to it, and is the wheat from the chaff that's left, but in the rest of the information jungle that's all around us. And I think that kind of a brand that you recognize and trust, that cuts through, and that affirms what you should be taking seriously and what you can set aside is really, really important, and that requires a resource to be able to do that.
And from your insight, your experience in terms of that resource, the renaissance that we're seeing in engagement, is that turning into financial resource as well? Are we seeing a renaissance in advertiser support?
Well, I mean, as Maria said, lots of companies that are still keeping the head above water. I think certainly over the last year, with the collapse of private sector advertising, then the need for government intervention in the short term has never been more critical, and the fair spending of public marketing in news brands has been essential. Now, we don't know what shape the advertising markets will be as we come out, but what I think it's illustrating is that the need for a strong subscription model has never been more important, and for a strong subscription model, you must have quality, sustainable and regular editorial. So we've kind of gone back, 200-300 years actually, where newspapers were not chicken and egg. What delivered the audience was the readership, and advertising came along after. I think that we have in many ways over the last 3 or 4 years, maybe longer, rediscovered that quality content is what drives the industry. The days of relying on mass circulations on the back of big classified platforms are gone and will not come back. So content's absolutely everything. We as I said before, the big companies like Reach can develop a model based also on data capture. Small guys, the independents can't do that, and the reliance on quality editorial and subscriptions is going to be even greater.
Just finally, before I come to Joshi, do you think that is worrying for independent journalism, though, if it's all big guys that are left in each of our markets? Is that a difficult place for this sector? Well,
it's a challenge, yes, but I think that the lessons of the engagement of the last year, which I was alluding to in my opening, are such that there is now a direct interest for the big guys to support the little guys. It's never been demonstrated more clearly that the whole of the, to use that horrible modern phrase, ecosystem of journalism, national and local, is interconnected. The power of arguments for freedom of expression, for accountability, and all of that are much stronger when you put them in a local context, and that gives the national publishers the ability to argue things more strongly than might otherwise be the case. So I think what we should be seeing is the evolution of support networks, which are distinct from government, because I think there's still enormous dangers in going down the road of direct subsidy and reliance on political patronage to support networks. But I think that what we've also seen is that you can't rely on one-man bands to provide regular and quality scrutiny of local decision making, and you can't rely on local publications which can or cannot appear, which the volume of material can be very variable. You need publications with the organisational scale of the Warrington Guardian, which I know very well. I trained in Chester at the old Chester Observer. Their importance has been demonstrated many times over in the last year, and I think that's a really good thing, because it means it's concentrating the minds of the big players on the importance of making sure that ecosystem is maintained, both from a credibility point of view, but also from a training point of view, to bring on the next generation of people who are going to scrutinise decisions at local, but also at national level. Francis Elliott, the political editor of the Times, was a reporter on the Carlisle Evening News, and then with me at the Edinburgh Evening News. That's the bedrock. The local press is the bedrock of the national press, and we've really come to appreciate that over the last year.
Yeah, thank you, Joshi. I want to come to you. Both John and Maria have talked about sort of cutting through and establishing a reputation for being trusted. How have you done that in the short space that you've been operating?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the assumption that people trust old newspaper brands, but they won't trust a sort of a new independent player, I think that's wrong. I think being close to your audience has been key for us. So, we address our readers in an email every morning when we send it to them. We're based in a newsletter, right? And I think people trust you if you show them you're working. You show how you're working out the COVID stats. You show why you're making certain assumptions about the way the numbers are moving. You talk to them about sort of how you're doing your journalism. I think if you're really open about how you're doing things, then people can sort of draw their own conclusions about whether you can be trusted. And I've had lots of emails from people who say, the Mill is the way that I get my local information about the pandemic. I even had a few people in Liverpool message me and say, could you do the same sort of coverage there? So I think people want clarity. I think what we've seen in the pandemic is a really amazing performance from a lot of local journalists. Like you're talking about often newsrooms that have been cut back right to the bone in the past 20 years. I mean, James Harding said in a speech in 2014 that a quarter of local journalists had lost their jobs since the millennium, but it must now be much more than that. I mean, last year, the biggest newspaper publisher in the country, Reach, cut 550 jobs in 1 year. So you're talking about newsrooms that are down really to the bone, and they are the young journalists, and it's mainly young journalists in them now, have done an amazing job. I mean, you know, it's quite inspiring to see sort of journalists who probably never reported much on health are suddenly having to work out how to, you know, put the stats together and how to report on hospitals. And there's been a huge amount of just effort that's gone into it. And I think local audiences will have really appreciated that and noticed it. The problem is that the underlying economics of news haven't changed. The problems that existed before the pandemic are at least as bad now, probably worse because of the huge advertising hit. You know, Reach PLC made £100 million less than it did last year, and its revenue had fallen for 2 years in a row. And that's the biggest one. So I think the way we need to look at this is, where is the real renaissance going to come from? We talked about a renaissance in the pandemic, and I think there has been in terms of viewership and relevance, no doubt. And as I said, I think a lot of journalists have done a brilliant, brilliant job at a local level. But where's the real renaissance going to come from? Long term, who is going to fix the funding model that we have in news? Every year, print revenue at every big newspaper group falls. And every year, digital revenue at the big newspaper groups doesn't rise enough to compensate for it, which is why the big groups are losing revenue every year. And I believe it's going to come from subscription. I think John's right. I think a big pivot to quality, a big return to the old principles of, when we hire a journalist, we need to give them time to work on stories. You can't tell a journalist to work on 10 stories in a day, or 8 stories in a day, or 6 in a day, and expect to have a quality thing that people will pay for. When we hire young journalists, we need to give them time to work on stories and do what we call old-fashioned journalism. And then we need to persuade people to pay for it. And they will pay for it. I mean, I've been running the mill only for a year, so I'm no expert in any of this, but we're already generating enough revenue for me to hire a graduate trainee in the spring, to pay for my own expenses. I've got 12 to 15 freelancers who are very good quality who work for me too. So people will pay for quality local news, but we need to focus on that quality. And I think, like, you know, final point was, I was visiting my mum recently in Sussex, and I went to the local shop. I picked up the paper. There used to be 2 papers in my local town. Now there's one. I picked it up. The first page was a story about the town. But when I turned the page, from that point onwards, the entirety of the rest of the paper was cribbed from another county, a next door county. It wasn't about the town. So there was one page about the town, and the rest was about stuff that wasn't relevant locally. It was effectively just the masthead still exists, one story, and then the rest of it's just a different paper. And like, that's how bad things are in a lot of towns now. So let's not kid ourselves that the pandemic is going to rescue local news. It's not. We need a new way of thinking. We need to encourage small independents to come into the market, and we need to return to quality and subscriptions, I think.
Thank you. We'll come back to this in a second, but I want to just bring Matt in from your experience, Matt, as an advertiser, as somebody that's worked alongside local newspapers. What do you think has driven this renaissance during the pandemic?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that it speaks to one side of the equation. So John and Joshi just talked about the fact that, okay, there are different revenue models, and you've got to explore what works, whether it's subs, whether it's advertising, whether it's some other means. But your starting point has to be audience. So have you got interest from people? And I think that it's interesting to look at what about the pandemic has changed people's engagement. And actually, it is partly, the new world. It is partly this new information. And things like, I think where local news and regional news has been hugely valuable is when we were in the tier systems and there wasn't one national rule, and I want to know how I can comply as a good law-abiding citizen in my area, but perhaps I'm not entirely clear what I'm supposed to be doing. my regional and local media gave me a fantastic service by telling me what was available to me. But I think that actually, if you look at the real driver, is it's less the pandemic and it's more lockdown. So research by people like Britain Thinks shows that the changing attitudes, whether that's consumption behavior or whether it's changing attitudes towards your local community and sense of place, are very different for those people who worked remotely from home versus those people who continue to go to their place of work because they couldn't work from home. So if you continue to go to work, the strengthening to your local patch wasn't as strong. It didn't happen as much than those people who, like me, I've worked from home since late March last year, and I haven't left my house very much. My sense of place in my local patch is very, very strong. So I think that yes, it's the pandemic, but it's principally the lockdown factor. What's interesting about that is we're obviously on the journey to being out of lockdown, hopefully for the final time. And I think the question then comes from, so what's next? So, depending on whether people go back to work 3 days a week, whether there's more remote working, how is it that local media can continue to support communities, given that there has been this strengthening sense of the connection with my community, where I live rather than where my office is? How can local media or regional media really serve me by giving me stuff that's highly relevant, that is bespoke to my area rather than what's happening in chains of cinemas? I want to know what's going in my local cinema or local events, local activities. And I think one stat that speaks to me as working for the operator of the National Lottery, which has put, in terms of its funding in response to COVID, is the largest outside of central government. It's awarded more than £800 million in response to COVID. And principally that money has been awarded to local volunteers. The thing that jumped out at me from the research is that 83% of people would like to volunteer or get involved with at least one activity in their local community, but they don't at the moment because they don't know how. And I think that if local and regional media can be a partner to them, can guide them to how to become more involved, how to make the most of this renaissance and your connection to your community, I think that's going to be a really powerful path for their relationship with the audience. And then, of course, the monetization of that, or the commercial model that supports this independent journalism, is a kind of separate question. I'll probably leave because I'm sure we'll come to it. But if you start with connecting to the audience, I think that's what people have enjoyed. I think it's what they'll retain, and showing them how to get involved in their local community will be a really valuable service to the community as well as to the readers.
I think that's a really, really interesting point. And it struck me as I've spoken to businesses in Warrington over the last 12 months. So many of them have said that they've welcomed customers that they've never met before, never seen before, and that engagement with local, because people couldn't travel far, because people aren't working in Manchester or Liverpool, and that interest in the local area, in village restaurants where people might have gone out to eat at lunchtime in Manchester. It's that local connection that's clicked back in, and as you say, Matt, it's sort of making the most of that, and the renaissance is actually not just in local media; it's driven through everything locally. I want to move on to another question in terms of supporting local media and what that should actually look like, and how we can encourage journalists to set up local media organisations like Joshi's done at the Mill, rather than just equating supporting local media with supporting the big four local newspaper groups that own most of the local press. John, can I sort of bring you in first on that? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I just wanted to clear something up, and also just to agree with something that Joshi said. I mean, I think I certainly wouldn't argue for a protectionist point of view that only the big companies can provide trusted and reliable media. I mean, I think that's an assumption too far, and that new entrants have got to be welcomed. And there are some great new entrants. We have the Hoik paper, which is a small startup, which is now performing really, really strongly, and has supplanted the Hoik News, which was a JP title, as the main vehicle in Hoik. So in what should always be a dynamic situation where new entrants come in and do new things and find sustainable models, I think that's a great thing. I would never argue that what we want to do is to preserve things as they were, and repel all borders. I mean, that's quite the opposite to what I'm saying. And I think it's the reliability and the constant coverage that's the key. Now, obviously, there are lots of places, certainly in the rest of the UK. Scotland's reasonably well served, but certainly in the rest of the UK where coverage is very patchy, and where new entrants come in and do great things. The sustainability of it is the issue, and I think that in that, the arguments are always, where is the money? Where has the money gone? And we come back in these discussions, we come back to the same thing. The money has gone down to very, very large foreign tech companies. That's where the vast majority of advertising has gone. And as we wake up through the digital markets unit, and watching what's happening in Australia, that there is an opportunity to channel money that is being generated on the back of local consumers consuming information into a sustainable future for reliable publishers of whatever scale, of whatever source they have arisen from. The job is to find ways in which we can get that resource and repurpose it in ways that benefit all. Okay. And I think that's beginning to come forward. Yeah. Okay. Everybody's waking up to this, and I think it's a great thing. And examples large and small will help that argument. Joshi's publication, Maria's publication, the Hoik paper, all of those publications, all have got a role to play in making sure that the tech giants, play a full part in the life of the media in the UK and abroad. And we've seen the models where things like self-regulation in both media and also advertising, where the industry as a whole can come together and support systems that benefit all without the need for political intervention. I mean, the ASA in particular is now being much more successful in getting the tech giants engaged in funding that system. We can take that argument much further, and I think there's so much hope now, but we just need to be able to channel it.
John, I want to bring in Joshi on this, and Joshi, you've got an audience of parliamentarians in front of you. From your experience, what do you think governments, legislators could be doing to help organisations like yourself, independent organisations, and to encourage independent journalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way it was framed in the way you framed the question, it said something like ending the assumption that supporting local news is about supporting the big 5 companies that own 80% of local newspapers. I think that's probably the first thing, is you've got to realize that we've been waiting, it's been 15 years now of year by year cuts in the staffing of local news. So it's probably not realistic to expect that that is going to change. There's no sign it's going to change. So I think if we want the renaissance we were talking about, we probably need to think more broadly. And that means that I think when government is thinking about local news and local journalism, it needs to be thinking about a much wider group of players, including lots of small independents, lots of entrants into the market who've come in the past few years. Last year when there was effectively a bailout of the newspaper industry in the form of an enormous advertising campaign, none of it went to these sort of 150, 200 very small publishers, even though they lobbied really hard for it. I mean, I'm not a member of their organization, but they lobbied really hard for it. They didn't get any of that money.
It didn't happen in Scotland, I have to say.
Sorry?
That didn't happen in Scotland.
Right,
Some of our ad deals did go to small independents.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So clearly, like just doing basics, like making sure that, you know, money like that is spread out more fairly. I think the Cancross review made a recommendation about a £10 million a year sort of funding package pot that could be done in very small grants. Because what you have is in this country, you have a lot of very talented journalists who are no longer working as journalists. They're either out of the game entirely because they lost their job, or they're not full-time anymore. And if there could just be little bits of funding that they could get hold of to tide them over for 6 months to a year while they're building up a new publication, a new site like the Mail, that would help a lot. You know, I had to dip into savings in order to not earn any money for 4 months, because I didn't make any money for June, July, August, September until I turned on my subscriptions. Now I'm breaking even. I can pay myself, and I'm about to pay someone else. So there's just this period what you need to get through. And I think if that 10 million was a pot that was created, I think that would help a lot. And I think there's also just a thing where, like, when government press offices are thinking about where to offer interviews and who to invite along to press conferences and who to meet about these kind of issues, if there are meetings about, you know, the future of funding local journalism, I think you've got to invite a broader coalition of people along. If your theory of the case as an MP or as a legislator, as someone in government, if your theory of the case is that the renaissance in local news, and by that I don't mean more jobs being created, I mean more jobs being created where the journalist actually has time to do reporting, not press releases, not writing things up from social media. If your theory of the case is that renaissance in hiring in local journalism is going to come from the existing industry, the established industry, then the current approach makes sense. If you think after 15 years of those companies cutting every year, that it's probably not going to come from that quarter, then we need to broaden out the conversation and really try and have a more innovation in local news. I mean, in America, you see a lot more innovative local news operations. You see newsletters coming out of big cities, big Rust Belt cities are creating like different ways of delivering online news. I think we've got a little bit less of that in the UK. That's my sense. But we have got a lot of good innovation. We've got a lot of really amazing small players. Can
I just sort of ask a question that Baroness Bonham Carter has just posted, and I think it's sort of interesting to get your sort of take on this. You're in Manchester. We've got the Liverpool Echo on this panel as well. What about, and you touched on this earlier about going to your mums and to the sort of small town. What's the model for somewhere down in the West Country that isn't a big city, that isn't, that hasn't got that huge wealth of advertisers that you can pull from? How do we get local news in areas like that?
I think, yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's definitely easier to map out what my vision for people paying for local news in cities, clearly, because you've just got this mass of people, you've got an awful lot going on. You know, my idea is that you can get 5,000 to 10,000 people paying for a publication in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Sheffield, and that will fund a proper team of journalists doing really good public interest work. I think the question is very fair about smaller communities. I would not claim to have the answer to that. I think maybe other people on the panel do that, but John does. But what I would say is there are some very good hyper-local websites that actually have a very healthy advertising model. They kind of have the old-fashioned thing of, if you're a local cafe, you want to go to them because they're the trusted local thing. They're making that work online. They're not doing these online advertising exchanges where the ads are coming in and the advertisers don't care where you are in the country. You're talking about local advertising, which is only relevant to local people. So there are actually loads of these hyper-locals. They're very small, they're often one person or two, and they are in small towns. And if we support them and give them a little bit more sort of a morale, and a little bit more backing, and make sure they get the support when government support comes through, I think those communities can be well served by those hyperlocals.
Okay. Maria, can I put that question to you, Tim? And you're in Liverpool. You're growing your product to cover the Wirral. What do you think is the future for smaller towns, for those sort of country areas that perhaps can't sustain a daily or even a weekly newspaper now?
Well, certainly at Reach, we've opened lots of live sites recently, which serve many of the smaller areas, and the response from that has been heartening, really. And I think it is for us is to look for opportunities and to go into areas where we think we can serve the community well and also grow as well. So it's not easy, and I know that some places have been badly hit, but you know, there are opportunities there that we can seek to maximise on, I think, as a big company, and that's what we've been doing over the past 12 months with the rollout of many live sites in more rural areas.
Do you think the future of local media is less about local print, local internet? It's local media. It's being involved in every sort of media operation because that's how you can actually finance it.
I think so. I mean, it's engagement, isn't it? It's engaging with your audience on whatever platform they choose to get their news from. And you're right to say people will pay for quality journalism. I think, you know, the Echo's circulation shows that, but you know, we have a free for all model that we're pursuing at the moment. And I'm keen to point out that, you know, scale can equate to quality too. Absolutely, it can. And the bigger the audience we have, the better for democracy. And I think also we can be part of the big groups, but we innovate too. There's plenty of innovation going on within the Liverpool Echo and the wider Reach family, I think. But it's really about engaging with our communities, and we've worked really hard at that over the past 12 months. In Liverpool, we send out a newsletter 3 times a day to 58,000 people who've chosen to subscribe to us. We talk to them through the newsletter. We have a very vibrant, as you can imagine, in Liverpool commenting system. So it is really sort of getting to know the audience, getting to know what they want, and making sure that we're where they want us to be.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a question of Matt now from one of my MP colleagues, Gagan Mahindra, asking about the importance of local council advertising, public notices in particular, and local press relying on that. Do you think funding should be protected for print media, or should that advertising be spent on online sites and community social pages as well? Matt, your thought as an advertiser.
Yeah, I think I should probably start by saying I don't know the answer to that question, Andy. But what I can say as an advertiser is that whoever is responsible for managing the budget has duties. So whether that is the duties of public funds and how you spend them effectively, we have the same. So money that is spent by the National Lottery needs to be used efficiently. We're judged on it and measured on it by the regulator, and therefore we can't just spend based on our preferences. We have to spend to deliver returns and deliver returns to good causes, because that's why we're here.
Would you spend on an independent website like The Mill?
Yes, but I think this comes in as to maybe a different model. So I think that blanket advertising for the purposes of Reach, and I don't mean Reach the organisation, I mean audience, is well, as far as I am aware, I know of no examples where it is better value for money or more efficient to spend that money with local or regional titles than it is with national titles, i.e. your pounds per thousand, the cost per thousand people you reach is just too expensive. And I think it's important to kind of face into that reality as to why the future will not lie on getting Coca-Cola's advertising budget to be spent with the Manchester Mill. However, I've actually met John and Maria before. I've been to Liverpool, and I've been all over the country. Nigel, our chief exec, and I, in normal times, every 3 weeks, go somewhere else in the UK. And we pretty shamelessly go and knock on Maria's door and John's door, and I will soon be knocking on Joshi's door to say, you know lots of things I don't know about National Lottery players, people who use National Lottery funding to great effect, and I need your help. And I think that the future is less about pitching for advertising on a cost per thousand basis. It's about partnership and saying, okay, Joshi, your audience care deeply about this. And actually, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, completely independently, Camelot doesn't decide where the money goes. The National Lottery Heritage Fund is going to fund this amazing new green space in Manchester. Let's engage your readers, right? What do they want it to look like? Let's partner up with the Heritage Fund and then say, look, there's lots of content you're going to create around this. That will have to be independent, but we can, we know that making the connection between people buying a ticket and what gets funded drives positivity, supports sales, delivers a return on investment. That's when we can really partner with people like the Manchester Mill and say, you offer me saying we'll put a Euro Millions jackpot advert on your site is just never going to work in terms of returns on investment. We're doing something brilliant in the area. Let's engage your audience, make sure we get it right, make sure they enjoy it, and deliver those returns. That's very interesting, and I think that covering, for us, and for of course, most importantly for the media titles, to find ways of partnering and offering something that is truly different from what ITV could offer, or to an extent, News UK and even Reach with their more regional approach rather than local. That differentiator is worth its weight in gold, because you're never going to win on price per 1,000 eyeballs.
I have a feeling you're going to find quite a lot of people knocking on your door now from what you've just said. I know, having spoken to in Warrington as well as the Warrington Guardian, there are two other local independent newspapers, the Warrington Worldwide and the Cheshire Times. Both have said to me how frustrating they find it that government, for example, sends them press releases but won't give them any money to advertise. They're very happy to use their news coverage, but actually won't spend. And I've raised this on numerous occasions with Cabinet Office, and again it comes down to contracts in many cases with advertising agencies, and I do think there's a real need for government to look and support more of the independent sector. I'm conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and lots of questions are coming in, so I want to pick up on some of those questions as well. I want to just talk for a second about the local democracy scheme that the BBC operates, because that's had quite a significant intervention into local news. And Maria, if I can bring you in on this, are you part of that local democracy scheme, and do you think it benefits local media having that scheme in place?
Yes, we are, and it's been valuable. It really has helped us to scrutinise authorities that we just hadn't scrutinised in that way for a long time. Brought up some brilliant stories. I saw the comment on the side about rewriting press releases. That is absolutely not what we do. Some of the great work we've done this year with the local democracy scheme was looking at the collapse of one of the last municipal bus companies in depth. That story would not have been told without the Liverpool Echo. Undoubtedly, we looked at asylum seekers being housed in a hotel that was being targeted by right-wing groups. It's been a great scheme, and it's brought something good to the newsroom, but it's also been of value for all the other people who are part of the scheme, and that includes the BBC too. But yeah, we're very, very much in support of it, and hope to win our contracts again when they come up.
And Joshi, can you access any of that scheme? And would you, as an independent provider, want to access the local democracy scheme?
We can't yet. So it takes a year after you've founded your new publication, then you can get access to it, and then you can start running the copy. I think it's a lot of the local democracy reporters are really good reporters. I often get information from the person who's been covering the Wigan council meeting or the Stockport budget meeting. So I think it's bringing loads of information to light, and they have some really good principles, like they're not allowed to just reproduce press releases. They have to file their story, on this wire so it can go to other independents locally. I think it's really great. Where the concern is that essentially we as license fee payers are funding this team of brilliant young reporters, not just young reporters, to do the council meetings. And that allows newspaper groups to take people off any local democracy reporting they were doing. They might not have been doing much, but they were doing a bit. They take that resource off, and suddenly you see on some of these local newspaper websites, under one byline, 15 stories have been written that day. And that has to be press releases. That has to be stuff from social media. That literally cannot be original journalism. There's just zero way it can be original journalism if you think about it. So the concern is that there's this displacement. It wasn't supposed to be. When the scheme was designed, there was an explicit part of that settlement that said you can't move people from original reporting out of it because of the local democracy reporters. They have to be supplementing what you're already doing. But when I look at some of these local newspapers and regional newspapers, that's clearly happened. And like, we need to solve this big problem that newspaper staffs are down to the bone. Young reporters are going in and writing 10 stories a day. That funding has been falling year on year, that staffing has been falling year on year. Let's not lose sight of that challenge. There's probably not, we've heard a lot of positive things today, but not a single positive thing we've heard today will in any way compensate for that problem, which is due to the underlying economics of local news, which needs to be fixed.
Okay, John, I want to come to you about the BBC's role and the importance of local journalism. Do you think the BBC's role and the distortion that it has in the market is a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I mean, it's something which needs to be constantly monitored. You know, and I think we've up here been relatively successful in making sure that any distortion that the BBC may bring is kept in check. I just wanted to talk a bit about the local democracy scheme, because obviously I'm on the end of it as well. I'm on both sides of this, because I see it as a councillor. It's very, very clear to me that the local democracy scheme has added to coverage. You know, when the coverage of Edinburgh Council was not as intensive before the LDR scheme came in. It improved when the first appointed reporter left and there was a gap. The coverage went down, and now there's a reporter back in place. The coverage has gone back up. So I don't think there's any doubt that in my experience, and I'm a focus group of one as far as this is concerned, without an empirical study of it, we're all just relying on our impressions. Is that my experience is that it has definitely added to coverage. I think the issue, I suppose, in the broadest philosophical sense about the LDR scheme being linked to the BBC is that it brings news coverage into the same political football pitch as the BBC. And I know this from a councillor point of view, that it means that local news coverage then becomes the focus of political activity to make sure that you get your say in any particular story, which is a new thing for newspapers. So, you know, but we're still very much at the early stages of the development of this kind of model, and I think there is something good in the model which funds local coverage from a pot, which is effectively what it is. Now, whether the BBC remains the right vehicle for that, whether the license fee remains the right source of that cash, these things are all open for future discussion. But I think that the idea of ensuring that there is proper coverage in a regulated environment for local decision making. And I think, you know, going beyond that into making sure that courts are covered and you know, tribunals and all the rest of it is worthy of exploration too. Okay. But we have to be careful about distorting the market for freelance journalists as well. But nonetheless,
I'm conscious of time, and I want to ask one more.
LDR has been a success.
Great, thank you. I want to ask one more question before we wrap up, and I'm conscious of time. And it's a very short question, but it's probably the most trickiest question to answer to all our panelists. And I'll come to you first, Maria. What is the next 5 years for local media, local journalism? Just tell us your thoughts in 30 seconds. Maria, what's your view over the next 5 years?
Continued growth, continued investment in journalism. Continue the idea that newspapers won't be here in 5 years' time, I think, is over exaggerated. So I think it's certainly far from being a niche market if we're talking about newspapers. So I expect the Liverpool Echo to be going just as strong, and just really for all of us to continue to, you know, campaign for our people, to work on behalf of the communities we serve. And importantly for me, to diversify as well and make sure that our makeup is properly reflective of those communities.
Thank you. John, can I come to you? Just 30 seconds, the next 5 years.
Audience growth, relevance growth. We need to accelerate in the next 5 years the solution to the revenue problem, and the models are there.
Yeah, Joshi, your thoughts? The next 5 years.
Yeah, totally agree with John. The revenue problem is the major problem. We used to have print advertising that was very local and very lucrative. We totally lost it. And online advertising has not worked for funding local news because hundreds of jobs get lost every year. So we need to move to subscription as the main model. And the way you do that is you persuade local people news is worth paying for. And the way you make it worth paying for is making it very distinctive, investigative, very, very trustworthy, very focused. I think that can happen, but I think everyone needs to focus on it coming from a multitude of sources rather than just the traditional established industry.
Thank you. I'm gonna move to Matt.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'll move to Matt as an advertiser. Matt, the next 5 years of local media.
Yeah, just before I say that, I'll say that we have an infinite appetite for creative new ways of doing things, but unfortunately we have an infinite budget. So I'm keen for people to knock on my door, but we can't fund every single item. In terms of the next 5 years, over the last 3, the National Lottery brand has come on leaps and bounds. We are the second most improved brand in the UK this year, according to YouGov. The first is Netflix. We achieved record sales last year, and I believe it is through this partnership model and working with local and regional newspapers we do it. So more of that will support us in raising more money for good causes.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to thank all of our speakers, to Maria, to John, to Joshi, and to Matt. It's a really fascinating conversation, really insightful comments, and also incredibly grateful to those people contributing on the chat as well. I'm sorry I didn't get to every question that was raised. We will send further details out to anybody that's raised a question and try and get some answers for you if we didn't manage to cover that today. But incredibly grateful to our speakers. We have a bi-monthly newsletter that is published via the group's website, and you can also follow us on social media channels as well. And we're keen to see blogs from organisation leaders and ideas for future meetings. So if you've joined us today for the first time and want to share your views on what a future meeting might include, we'd really like to hear that as well. Highlights that we're always looking for as well are new sponsors. So if you want to contribute financially to the running of our APPG, we'll be keen to talk to you about that as well. It just allows me to draw this meeting to a close and thank our speakers again, and also you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really great, really interesting conversation. We covered lots and lots of topics, and I thought it was a really broad and very insightful conversation.
Thanks.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Maria, Joshi, both of you, I'd love to catch up with both of you at some point, because I'm midway between both of you, so be great to do that. And John, when you're next coming down to Warrington, just let me know, because it'd be good to catch up.
I sat my shorthand 6 times in Warrington.
Probably got bad memories then. That's really good. Thank you very much indeed, guys.
Thank you.
Up the wire.
Bye-bye.